It was a Sunday morning in late April 1977, the kind of warm, hazy Florida morning when the air already carried a touch of humidity and the world moved just a little slower. 10-year-old Theresa Fillingim had spent that morning at St. Luke's Baptist Church in Tampa. She was one of those kids everyone in town seemed to know. Polite, soft-spoken, always smiling. Her mother, Helen, had ironed her white dress that morning, the one with tiny blue flowers stitched along the hem, and fastened a small silver locket around her neck. Inside the locket were 2 photographs, one of her mother, the other of her older sister, Rita. It had been a birthday gift just 3 weeks earlier. When service ended around 11:30, the congregation spilled out into the bright sunlight. Kids ran toward the ice cream truck that parked outside every Sunday, the sound of laughter mixing with the chatter of families making lunch plans. Theresa stayed behind for a few minutes, helping one of the elderly ladies gather hymnals into a basket, something she'd done since she was little. By noon, she waved goodbye to the pastor and started her short walk home. It was just under a mile, maybe 15 minutes on foot. She'd done it dozens of times before, down Oakfield Avenue, across Myrtle Street, then a right turn past the old bait shop that sat near the drainage canal. Everyone in that part of town knew the route. Nothing about it was unusual, but by 1 o'clock, when Helen realized the house was still quiet, something felt wrong. At first, she assumed Theresa had stopped to talk with friends. Then, she thought maybe the church service had run long. She called the neighbor across the street. No, hadn't seen her. She phoned her sister, then the pastor. No one had. Within an hour, she was outside on the porch, pacing, staring down the road for that familiar flash of white fabric. By mid-afternoon, the sun had given way to heavy clouds, the kind that turned daylight into a strange gray silence. When Helen called the police just before 4, she still hoped it was a misunderstanding, that maybe her daughter had gone to the park or was walking home slowly. But when officers arrived, their tone shifted the moment they learned Theresa was only 10. Detectives began canvassing the area immediately. Volunteers and parishioners joined in, forming search lines through the narrow strip of woods behind the church. Deputies checked culverts, drainage ditches, and abandoned sheds behind the gas station. Others stopped cars along Oakfield, asking if anyone had seen a girl matching her description: shoulder-length brown hair, white dress, silver necklace. The rain started just after dusk, light at first, then steady. It soaked through flashlights and search dogs and washed away whatever faint footprints might have existed along the dirt shoulders. By nightfall, the only sound left was the hum of police radios and the low rumble of thunder. Neighbors stayed up that night watching from porches as cruisers rolled by, headlights sweeping across fences and mailboxes, the kind of scene that makes a neighborhood hold its breath. By Monday morning, every major road leading out of town had Theresa's description posted on telephone poles and gas station windows. Detectives questioned nearly everyone who'd attended church that day. A few remembered seeing her talking to someone near the vending machine outside the Sunday school hall. Others mentioned a tan van that had been parked near the side lot, one they didn't recognize. The bait shop owner, a man in his 50s named Charlie Dunn, told officers he saw her pass by around 12:30, heading toward home. She'd waved, he'd waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting. As days passed, the investigation deepened but yielded nothing. Deputies scoured the nearby swampy lowlands, bringing in boats to check retention ponds and the narrow canal that ran parallel to the highway. They found discarded cans, a bicycle tire, a rusted shopping cart, but no trace of Theresa. Helen sat in her living room each night, listening to the rain against the window and the static of the police scanner she'd borrowed from a neighbor. She told reporters later that it was the silence that scared her the most, not knowing whether her daughter was out there somewhere calling for help or if she was already gone. By the end of the week, the search had drawn in local media. Cameras filmed officers trudging through mud with sticks and flashlights, the sheriff giving measured statements about ongoing leads. But behind closed doors, detectives admitted they had almost nothing. No eyewitness accounts, no physical evidence. Only a few scattered rumors. A drifter seen near the railroad tracks, a transient offering kids rides in exchange for pocket change, and a sighting of a van on the outskirts of town that matched no local registrations. When a psychic from Orlando called, claiming she'd seen the girl in a vision, Helen, desperate, even agreed to meet her. Deputies followed up, but it led nowhere. Each false lead chipped away at the fragile hope that maybe Theresa was still alive. Weeks turned into months. Volunteers dwindled. The posters in shop windows began to yellow in the sun. By late summer, her case had quietly shifted from active search to missing person, presumed abducted. The church held a vigil that August. 100 candles lined the steps of St. Luke's as the choir sang softly into the night. Helen stood in the front row, gripping that same silver locket she'd given her daughter, a duplicate she'd ordered from the same catalog. She refused to take it off, telling herself that if Theresa could somehow see her, she'd know her mother was still waiting. But as the seasons changed, the small Florida town changed with them. Parents stopped letting their children walk to school. Stores closed earlier. People started locking doors that had always been left open. What happened to Theresa Fillingim became a kind of unspoken warning, a reminder that safety could vanish as quickly as a child on her way home from church. Detectives kept her file active for years, updating it whenever a tip came in, but nothing ever stuck. Even as other cases emerged, other girls missing from nearby counties, none of it led back to her. Still, Helen never moved. She stayed in that same house on Myrtle Street, the same one Theresa was supposed to walk back to that morning. Every night, she left the porch light on, and for the next 40 years, it would remain that way, a single light burning through storms, holidays, and decades of silence. Because in her heart, she believed that one day, something would finally come back. Something, or someone, would tell her what really happened after her daughter waved goodbye at the corner of Oakfield and Myrtle. That day wouldn't come for another 41 years, but when it did, it would begin not with a detective or a clue, but with a park ranger walking through the woods after a storm, noticing something small glinting in the mud. By midsummer, the search for 10-year-old Theresa Fillingim had quieted to a painful hum in the background of daily life. The woods had been combed, the drainage canals dragged, and the sheriff's office had exhausted every lead it could find. Volunteers stopped showing up to the staging area behind St. Luke's Baptist Church, and the posters that once covered every storefront began to curl and fade in the heat. For Helen Fillingim, time had stopped moving. Each night she left the porch light on, waiting for the sound of small footsteps on the gravel. It stayed on for months, through rainstorms, through power outages, through nights when she sat in a chair by the window and refused to sleep. That light became a fixture of the neighborhood, a quiet reminder that one of their own was still missing. Detectives tried to keep the case alive. One report claimed Theresa had been spotted at a truck stop near Ocala, walking with a man in a baseball cap. Another tip described a traveling preacher seen around Hillsborough and Pasco counties, offering rides to families between revivals. Each story carried a flicker of hope, but each ended the same way. No proof, no follow-up, no trace. Months turned into years, and the world moved on without her. The original investigation file, once filled with daily updates, became a stack of aging paperwork tucked into a filing cabinet marked Missing Persons. 1970, 1980. New crimes, new victims, new priorities pushed the old ones further into the past. By 1983, the original lead detective, Frank Delaney, had been transferred to narcotics. When he finally retired in 1989, he handed over a single worn box labeled in thick black marker, Fillingim, 1977. Inside were yellowing photographs, witness statements, soil sample records, and a single Polaroid of the locket Theresa wore that morning. Every few years, a new investigator would pull it out, flip through the contents, and make a few calls. But nothing ever moved. The case felt sealed by time itself. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread through nearby towns. In Hernando and Citrus counties, 2 other girls had vanished under similar circumstances, both young, both last seen near small churches along back roads. In Levy County, a 12-year-old disappeared walking home from a Sunday picnic. The pattern was too specific to ignore. Parents began driving their children everywhere, locking doors that had never needed keys. Local papers occasionally hinted at a theory that a drifter, a serial predator, had been moving through Florida's west coast throughout the late 1970s, preying on girls in small rural communities. There was no evidence, no name, just a shadow that seemed to hover over a string of tragedies. For those who'd lived through it, that decade became known as the years when innocence disappeared. For Helen, the silence was worse than any horror story. She kept a notebook filled with every rumor she heard: license plate numbers, descriptions of vans, sightings of girls who looked like Theresa. In her mind, each new piece might be the missing part of the puzzle. She called detectives so often that one of them, years later, admitted that whenever the phone rang after midnight, he expected it to be her. By the late 1980s, the Fillingim home had become a monument to memory. The same white curtains hung in the front window, the same framed photo of Theresa smiling on Easter morning stood on the mantel. The locket, its duplicate, still rested around Helen's neck. Neighbors said she talked to her daughter sometimes, just quietly, in the evenings, as if she were still sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. In the sheriff's department, Theresa's case shifted from active to archival. The bulletin board near the cold case files displayed dozens of black and white photos, but hers stood out. A child's face, slightly faded, smiling without understanding the weight that picture would someday carry. Next to it, a note in blue pen read simply, "Last seen April 27th, 1977. Officers who joined the department in later years were told her story during training. It became a kind of legend, the girl who vanished on her walk home from church. It reminded every detective how fragile an investigation could be when evidence disappeared and time got in the way. Helen lived through every false hope that followed. Each time skeletal remains were found in a nearby county, the sheriff's office would call her, gently explaining they were testing DNA. Each time, the results came back negative. She would thank them, hang up, and go back to her quiet vigil by the window. There were moments when she tried to move forward. She took part-time work at a local thrift store, joined a prayer group, even planted a garden. But she never changed her phone number, never left town, never stopped waiting. Every holiday season, she placed a small silver ornament on the tree, a heart-shaped one that looked just like the locket Theresa had worn. And every year she whispered the same promise under her breath: "I'll keep the light on." By the 1990s, most of the people who'd known Theresa as a child had grown up, moved away, started families of their own. The story became something they told their children to explain why they shouldn't walk alone. In Tampa, the Fillingim case faded into the long list of Florida's unsolved mysteries. One more name in a file room stacked floor to ceiling with grief. Yet, even in its silence, the case endured. Every now and then, an officer would walk by that old bulletin board and pause at the picture of the little girl in the white dress, the faint smile that time hadn't erased. They didn't know it yet, but the answer, the truth about what happened that April morning, wasn't lost forever. It was buried deep in the woods less than 30 miles away, waiting, hidden beneath the roots of old trees and years of soil, alongside the one thing that would one day bring Theresa home again: her locket. The summer storm that rolled through the Withlacoochee State Forest in 2018 wasn't remarkable by Florida standards. It was short, violent, and left the kind of damage that only locals knew how to clean up. Fallen limbs, shallow floods, and a few uprooted trees scattered across old trails. For Park Ranger David Rowan, it was just another week of post-storm patrol, the kind of slow, methodical work that came after every bout of bad weather. That morning, the forest felt heavier than usual. The ground was soft underfoot, the air thick with the smell of wet soil and pine. Rowan worked alone, inspecting the outer edge of a closed hiking trail not far from Croom Road. The area had been off limits for years due to erosion, but the storm had pushed debris across the access gate, and he needed to make sure no one had wandered in. He was clearing a fallen oak when something caught the light near the base of an uprooted tree. It wasn't big, just a faint flash of silver against the brown mud. He crouched down, brushed away a clump of dirt, and felt something cold between his fingers. A small heart-shaped locket, half buried, still attached to what looked like the remnants of a rusted chain. At first, he thought it was just another piece of lost jewelry, maybe dropped by a hiker years ago. But when he rubbed away the grime with his thumb, a name appeared faintly on the back: Theresa F. The engraving was delicate, nearly worn smooth by time. He opened it carefully. Inside were two miniature photographs, water-damaged, almost ghost-like from decades of moisture. One showed a young girl with a round face and straight brown hair. The other was too faded to make out. For a moment, he just stared, realizing that this wasn't a hiker's trinket. This looked old, Rowan logged the discovery, bagged the locket according to standard park protocol, and continued his route. But something about it gnawed at him. The name, the style, the way it seemed untouched for so long. When he got back to the ranger station later that afternoon, he looked up missing person reports from the surrounding counties. An old habit of curiosity he'd picked up after years in law enforcement before joining the Park Service. The name appeared almost instantly. Theresa Fillingim, age 10. Missing since April 27, 1977. Last seen leaving a church in Tampa. The description listed a silver heart-shaped locket engraved with her initials. Rowan felt his stomach tighten. The location of her disappearance, roughly 30 miles south. The time frame, over 40 years. The possibility that the small piece of metal he'd just unearthed had spent 4 decades beneath that tree. He contacted the Hernando County Sheriff's Office the next morning. Within hours, detectives were at the ranger station, photographing and cataloging the locket. The engraving, they confirmed, matched the description from the original missing person file. It was enough to reopen a case that had been cold for more than 4 decades. Detective Lisa Vance, a veteran investigator in her 50s, was assigned to the lead. She requested archival access to the original 1977 case files stored in the county evidence vault. Inside, the photos and paperwork were brittle, the ink faded, but there it was, a handwritten description of Theresa's necklace, drawn in her mother's words, small silver heart, chain clasp worn from use. Forensic analysts began examining the locket itself. They confirmed it had likely been exposed to soil and moisture for decades, but found microscopic traces of biological material on the hinge, too degraded for DNA, but enough to suggest it had been buried, not dropped. The chain links were fused by rust, indicating long-term exposure beneath tree roots or compacted earth. That was enough for the sheriff's office to authorize a search of the surrounding area. A team of deputies, forensic technicians, and volunteer archaeologists from the University of South Florida arrived 2 days later. They cordoned off a perimeter around the uprooted tree and began sifting through the soil layer by layer. The first day turned up nothing, just animal bones and pieces of broken glass. But on the third morning, one of the technicians flagged something unusual. A small section of compacted soil that looked artificially disturbed. Beneath it, under 2 feet of sediment, lay a partial human skull. The excavation slowed to a crawl. Forensic teams worked through the weekend, uncovering fragmented skeletal remains tangled in old roots and clay. There were remnants of clothing fibers too degraded to identify, and several small buttons consistent with a child's dress from the 1970s. The bones appeared undisturbed, protected for decades by the roots of the fallen tree that had only recently been torn loose by the storm. The scene was methodical, respectful, almost silent, except for the hum of generators and the faint scrape of shovels. Every fragment was documented, photographed, and sealed. The bones were then transferred to the medical examiner's office in Brooksville, where forensic anthropologists began their analysis. By the end of that week, word began to spread quietly through the sheriff's office. Detectives who had been around long enough to remember the old case whispered that the Fillingim family might finally have an answer. Preliminary testing confirmed the remains belonged to a young female, approximately 10 to 12 years old at the time of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma due to the deterioration, but the proximity to the locket and the isolated nature of the burial site left little doubt. This was the same Theresa who had vanished after church 41 years earlier. When Helen Fillingim received the call, she was 80 years old. The detective on the line said her daughter's necklace had been found in a forest, and that a team was working to confirm what they believed were her remains. According to the report later filed, she didn't speak for nearly a minute. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "I knew she'd never have taken it off." The discovery reignited national attention. Local news ran archive photographs of the missing child, the church she'd left that Sunday, and a now faded picture of her mother standing on the porch under that same porch light that had burned for decades. For law enforcement, the case was both a tragedy and a revelation. The location of the remains was less than 30 miles from where Theresa had disappeared, in an area that had been nothing but forest and swamp in the late 1970s. It raised questions that hadn't been asked in decades. Who had taken her there, and why had no one found her sooner? As forensic teams cataloged the evidence, they realized this wasn't just the recovery of a single child's remains. It was the reawakening of a pattern. In those same woods, investigators found other disturbed soil patches that would soon yield more discoveries, connecting Theresa's story to something much darker lurking in Florida's past. For now, though, the forest remained still again, the ground resealed, the trail closed once more. But beneath the noise of insects and the rustle of pine, the truth had finally started to surface, and with it came the first real lead in a case that had been silent for 41 years. That locket, small, silver, and worn, had done something no detective could. It had survived time. And in doing so, it had just reopened one of Florida's most haunting mysteries. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 15 days of research and long nights chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going, and if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. By late spring of 2018, word had spread through the Hernando County Sheriff's Office that the locket found in Withlacoochee State Forest wasn't just a piece of lost jewelry. It was evidence, the kind that could finally close a 41-year-old missing child case. Within days, the department officially reclassified the Theresa Fillingim case from missing person to active homicide investigation. For the first time since 1977, her name appeared again on a current case board. Detective Lisa Vance led the renewed inquiry. She was known for her calm persistence, the kind of investigator who didn't flinch at time or what it eroded. When she received the DNA results from the medical examiner's office, the report was both clinical and devastating. The test compared genetic material from Theresa's remains to a sample provided by her surviving sister, Rita, now in her 50s. The match was conclusive. The little girl who vanished on her way home from church had finally been found. For the Fillingim family, that confirmation landed like a mix of heartbreak and relief. Decades of uncertainty ended with a single line in a lab report. Helen, too frail to travel, listened quietly on the phone as Detective Vance explained that her daughter's remains had been recovered in a wooded area less than 30 miles from where she disappeared. When asked if there was anything she wanted the detective to know, Helen simply said, "Tell her she's home now." The sheriff's office held a short press briefing to confirm the identification. Local media outlets covered it immediately. Grainy photos of Theresa's missing poster from 1977 flashing across television screens once again. Reporters called it a 40-year mystery finally beginning to unravel. They spoke about the storm that unearthed the locket, the ranger who found it, and how modern forensics had done what time and circumstance had failed to do. But behind the press statements and archive footage, the real work had just begun. Detectives reopened every file connected to missing or murdered children from the same region and era, cross-referencing unsolved cases across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. What they began to see was a disturbing overlap. Similar victims, similar burial methods, and one name that kept resurfacing in the old files: Billy Mansfield, Jr. Mansfield was a known predator who terrorized Florida's Gulf Coast in the late 1970s and early 80s. He'd been convicted in 1982 for a string of murders that included young women and teenage girls. His arrest had made national headlines after detectives discovered multiple shallow graves behind his family's property in Spring Hill, Florida, less than 20 miles from the very church Theresa had attended. At the time, investigators believed they had found all of his victims, but those discoveries had come after Theresa's disappearance. In fact, some of the earliest reported victims were buried just months after she vanished. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Mansfield's victims were typically small in stature, buried in shallow ground near wooded or rural property lines, and often found with personal items still intact: jewelry, hair clips, or clothing. Detective Vance and her team requested access to the archived evidence from Mansfield's 1981 conviction. The boxes arrived coated in dust, filled with Polaroids, soil samples, and crime scene sketches drawn in the pre-digital era. When the old photos were laid out across the conference table, the pattern became clearer. The burial locations, every one of them, mirrored the topography of where Theresa's remains had been found. Wooded areas bordering rural property lines, close to unpaved access roads, with the bodies concealed just deep enough to survive a surface search, but shallow enough that nature could eventually expose them. Forensic specialists compared the locket's corrosion and the composition of the surrounding soil to samples from the Spring Hill burial sites. The results were chillingly consistent. Same mineral profile, same type of compacted clay layer that formed after decades underground. Even the spacing of the skeletal remains and the root entanglement matched what they'd seen in Mansfield's other victims. Meanwhile, cold case analysts revisited every statement from the 1970s investigation. Back then, a local shop owner had mentioned a tan van parked near the church the morning Theresa disappeared. In the original report, the van's description had been written off as too vague to pursue, but in one of Mansfield's later cases, witnesses described that same vehicle, a beige 1969 Dodge, seen near the area where another girl vanished. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough for investigators to revisit the timeline. They discovered that Mansfield had been living intermittently in the Tampa area during 1976 and 1977, helping his father run a small junk removal business. His family property in Spring Hill, where multiple bodies were later found, sat less than a 45-minute drive from St. Luke's Baptist Church, the very place Theresa was last seen alive. As evidence mounted, the sheriff's office quietly reached out to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the FBI's Cold Case Division. They wanted to verify whether any physical evidence from Mansfield's original conviction still existed that could yield DNA profiles using modern technology. It had been nearly 40 years since those items were collected, but in the forensic lab, even the smallest trace could change everything. When the first DNA comparison was made between Mansfield's stored genetic sample and the degraded trace found on a button recovered near Theresa's remains, the result came back consistent with possible contact. It wasn't a full match, too damaged to be definitive, but it narrowed the field dramatically. Statistically, only a handful of individuals in the region could share those markers. Mansfield was one of them. Detective Vance contacted the California Correctional Facility, where Mansfield was still serving his life sentence. The department's cold case unit formally requested an interview. It was the first time in nearly 4 decades that anyone had confronted him about a victim who predated his known crimes. The request was met with silence at first, then a single reply: "Send what you got." Even without a confession, investigators knew they were closer than anyone had ever been. They pieced together Theresa's final moments as best they could. A child walking home from church, lured by a stranger offering a ride, then taken north toward Hernando County, where a shallow grave waited under a canopy of pine and oak. Reporters began to revisit old footage of Mansfield's trial, drawing parallels between his confirmed victims and Theresa's case. Each newscast repeated the same haunting detail, that her silver locket had remained intact after 41 years. The same way Mansfield's other victims had been found with their jewelry untouched. It became an eerie signature, one that tied the past to the present. For the Fillingim family, the attention was both validating and painful. Helen refused interviews. Rita, however, spoke briefly to a local journalist. She said she wasn't angry anymore. She just wanted her sister's story to be finished. She wanted her mother, who now rarely left her chair by the window, to know that someone had finally been held accountable. Within the sheriff's office, investigators began mapping other potential burial sites connected to Mansfield's movements in the 1970s. What started as one child's rediscovery now looked like a doorway into a wider pattern. Dozens of missing persons cases across Florida and Georgia suddenly being reevaluated through the lens of a single name. Forensic experts would later describe it as one of those rare moments when the smallest detail, a rusted piece of jewelry found by chance, rewrote an entire timeline of violence. By the end of 2018, the evidence surrounding Theresa's murder had grown strong enough to formally link her case to Mansfield's known crimes. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either, but when questioned, he reportedly smirked and said, "They were all close enough to home." The case file that had once sat forgotten in a box marked 1977 was now displayed across an entire wall in the sheriff's office. Photos of Theresa's locket, the forest where she was found, and the man believed to have taken her were pinned side by side. For the detectives who'd spent their lives chasing ghosts, this was the first time they could point to something tangible, a connection that tied the little girl's disappearance to one of Florida's most notorious serial killers. Still, for Helen and Rita, the word justice felt distant. What they had instead was truth, raw, painful, and long overdue. And yet, even with the discovery of Theresa's remains and the confirmation of her killer, the story wasn't over. Because when detectives revisited the Spring Hill property where Mansfield had once lived, cadaver dogs alerted on a section of ground that had never been searched, and beneath that patch of soil, they would uncover something that would reveal the full scope of what had been hiding there all along. When detectives reopened the old case logs from 1981, the handwriting on the pages had begun to fade, the kind of ink that bleeds into the paper after decades. Those notes were taken during the original search of Billy Mansfield Jr.'s property in Spring Hill, Florida, back when law enforcement first uncovered the graves that led to his conviction. They'd found 4 victims there, all young women buried behind the Mansfield family home, but something in those files had gone unnoticed for years. It was a short, almost careless line scribbled in the margin of a deputy's report. Subject claims another site near the forest. Never found it. It was easy to dismiss at the time. Mansfield had been known to taunt investigators, mixing truth with lies to keep control of the story. But now, with Theresa Fillingim's remains discovered less than 30 miles from that same property, that note no longer felt like idle boasting. It felt like a map. Detective Lisa Vance ordered a full re-examination of the 1981 search materials. Every photograph, soil report, and testimony was reviewed, this time through the lens of modern technology. She noticed a detail in the crime scene diagrams that caught her attention. The property line of Mansfield's family land bordered a stretch of undeveloped woods that, back in the 1970s, connected directly to the area where Theresa's locket had been found. The 2 sites were separated only by a county line and a dirt road that ran through the forest. By late 2018, the Sheriff's Department authorized an exploratory search around that connecting area. Cadaver dogs were brought in first, trained to detect human decomposition through decades of soil and vegetation. They began near the site where Ranger Rowan had discovered Theresa's locket. Within minutes, 2 of the dogs alerted in almost the exact same direction, a small ridge roughly 200 yards from the original excavation site. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed next, and what it revealed sent a chill through everyone present. Beneath the surface were 3 separate subsurface anomalies, areas where the ground density differed from its natural composition, each roughly the size and depth of a small grave. The search team marked them and began excavation. The first dig revealed bones, small, fragile, and long buried. The second contained partial remains intertwined with fabric fibers and a child's shoe. The third site took longer to reach. It was deeper, protected by tree roots that had grown around it like a cage. When they finally uncovered what was inside, it was another skeleton. Also young, female, likely buried in the late 1970s. Forensic testing over the following weeks confirmed what everyone already suspected. The 2 newly discovered victims matched the age range, time frame, and burial method consistent with Mansfield's known pattern. One was identified through dental records as a girl reported missing from Clearwater in 1978. The other's identity remained unknown, though investigators believe she might have been a runaway whose disappearance had never been officially reported. The sheriff's office now had direct physical evidence linking Mansfield's activities to the forest where Theresa had been found. This wasn't just coincidence, it was a continuation. A single predator's hunting ground stretched across county lines, one that had gone undiscovered for more than 40 years. Detective Vance and her team compiled the findings into a new case file. It included the forensic evidence, the 1981 search note, and the new excavation reports. They sent it to the California Correctional Facility, where Mansfield had been serving his life sentence since the early 80s. A formal request was made for an interview. For months, there was no response. Then, on a quiet morning in November, the warden called back. Mansfield had agreed to talk. The interview took place inside a small visitation room with cinder block walls and flickering fluorescent lights. Mansfield, now in his 60s, sat across from two detectives. He was thinner, gray-haired, but still carried that same unsettling composure he was known for during his trial, detached, almost amused by the attention. When asked about Theresa Fillingim, he didn't hesitate long. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Yeah, I remember her. Church girl. Pretty little thing. Said she was walking home." He paused, studying the reaction on the detectives' faces. "Told her I'd give her a ride. She said no at first. But then it started to rain." According to the transcript, Mansfield claimed he'd been driving near St. Luke's Baptist Church that Sunday in April 1977, not far from where Theresa disappeared. He said he offered her a lift, told her he lived just up the road, and that he could get her home before the storm got worse. Once she got into the car, he drove north, not toward her neighborhood, but toward Hernando County, near his brother's property. There, after the storm had passed, he said he did what he always did. He buried her in a shallow grave under the tree line, not far from a dirt road that led into the state forest. When detectives pressed him for details, Mansfield's answers came in fragments, small, chilling sentences delivered without emotion. He said he kept her locket because she looked proud of it, and that he'd thrown it away later when the chain broke. That single action, discarding the locket, would be what tied him back to her more than 4 decades later. In the official report, investigators noted that his confession matched the forensic evidence almost perfectly. The burial site, the location, the storm, even the approximate depth of the grave, all of it lined up. It was the final confirmation of what had haunted the Fillingim family for over 40 years. When news of the confession reached Florida, a press conference was held outside the sheriff's office. Reporters gathered beneath a gray sky as Detective Vance stood at the podium holding a photo of Theresa, the same one that had hung on the cold caseboard for decades. She confirmed publicly that Billy Mansfield Jr. had confessed to abducting and killing 10-year-old Theresa Fillingim in April 1977. In the front row sat Helen Fillingim, now 83, wrapped in a light shawl and gripping that same photo of her daughter. She listened without expression, her eyes fixed on the ground. When a reporter approached afterward, she didn't say much. She just whispered, "I always knew she didn't just walk away." The confession brought resolution, but not comfort. For Helen, it wasn't justice. It was validation of what she had known in her heart for decades, that her daughter hadn't run away, hadn't gotten lost, hadn't disappeared by accident. She'd been taken. Detectives continued their excavation of the surrounding area in the following weeks, uncovering additional soil disturbances that hinted at more graves, victims who still hadn't been identified. Each new find only deepened the picture of Mansfield's crimes, a portrait of a man who used the isolation of rural Florida to hide what he'd done. In the final report, investigators noted that the forest's overgrowth had likely preserved the remains for decades, concealing them beneath roots and brush until the 2018 storm tore through the area. It was a chain of chance, a fallen tree, a flash of silver, and a locket that refused to stay buried, that finally brought the truth to light. Back in California, Mansfield showed no remorse. When asked why he was finally willing to talk, he smirked and said, "Because you already found her." For law enforcement, the confession closed one of the state's longest unsolved child murders. But for those who'd lived through it, the officers who'd searched in the rain in 1977, the neighbors who'd kept their children close for years after, it was a reminder that monsters don't just vanish when the headlines fade. They wait in silence, buried beneath time, until the earth itself gives them up. In the end, what remained of Theresa Fillingim was returned to her family in a small wooden box. Her locket, cleaned and restored, was placed inside with her. That fall, Helen had her daughter's remains buried beside her late husband in Tampa, under a headstone that simply read, "Theresa Marie Fillingim, 1967, 1977, found 2018. The porch light at the Fillingim home stayed on for one final night after the burial. Then, for the first time in 41 years, Helen turned it off. But the story wasn't finished yet, because while Theresa's case had finally been solved, the ground behind Mansfield's old property still held secrets, And what investigators would find next would prove that Theresa hadn't been the only one waiting to be found. In the months that followed the confession, the story of Theresa Fillingim slowly moved from the front page to the background noise of local news. But for those who had lived with her absence for 4 decades, her name never faded. It lingered in the spaces she once filled. In the worn chair her mother refused to replace, in the photo that still sat on the mantel, and in the locket that had survived 41 years underground. The Sheriff's Department finalized its report in early 2019. For the first time, the words "case closed" appeared beside Theresa's name. It wasn't a victory anyone celebrated. It was a quiet end to something that had haunted the county since the late 70s. Investigators described the case as one of those rare instances where coincidence and persistence met. A storm that uprooted a tree, a park ranger who stopped to look closer, and a glint of silver in the mud that refused to stay buried. The locket itself became the symbol of the entire investigation. Forensic analysts had cleaned it carefully, preserving every dent and scratch. Inside, the tiny photograph, once blurred and water-stained, was restored enough to make out the faint outline of a child's face. Her smile was small but unmistakable. It was the same picture that had been pinned to missing person boards, printed in newspapers, and carried in her mother's purse for decades. When the sheriff's office announced they would hold a small memorial at the forest trail where she was found, people came from every nearby county. Retired detectives, reporters who had covered the case in the 70s, and families of other missing children all stood quietly among the trees. The spot itself had been cleared and stabilized by park workers. A small wooden platform had been built near the base of the old oak, the same tree whose fall had revealed Theresa's locket in the first place. Ranger David Rowan stood near the front, holding a small glass case. Inside it, under soft light, sat the locket. The inscription, Theresa F., still visible on the back. He hadn't expected to feel emotional, but as the sheriff spoke about the years of silence and the miracle of discovery, Rowan couldn't help but look toward the patch of soil where he'd found it. It was almost surreal to think that the small object he'd nearly overlooked had unraveled a mystery older than he was. Detective Lisa Vance spoke next, her voice steady but heavy. She talked about how this case reminded her, and everyone in law enforcement, that some stories never really end, that sometimes evidence doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to be found. She gestured toward the locket and said it best. This was never just jewelry. It was proof that time can bury truth, but it can't destroy it. When the service ended, the glass case was placed on display at the Hernando County Historical Center under a plaque that read, "Recovered after 41 years, Theresa Marie Fillingim, 1967-1977. It sat beside a brief description of the case, a child who vanished on her way home from church, a family that never stopped hoping, and a storm that finally gave them an answer. Visitors still stop to look at it, not because it's beautiful, but because it feels impossibly human. For Helen Fillingim, the memorial marked the first time in decades she'd left her home for something other than medical appointments. She arrived in a wheelchair, her daughter Rita beside her, holding her hand. When the sheriff helped her approach the display, she stared at the locket for a long time without speaking. Then, quietly, she said, "She's home." Those were the only words she needed. The story of Theresa's case would eventually make its way into documentaries and articles about unsolved murders finally brought to light through modern forensics. Her name would be mentioned alongside the others, the forgotten victims of the 1970s whose disappearances had once been dismissed as runaways or lost children. But what made her story different wasn't just the crime. It was how she was found, how something so small, something meant for love, had survived storms, decades, and decay to tell the truth. Back at the forest, the trail where her remains were found was renamed Fillingim Path, a narrow, shaded walkway that wound through the trees before ending at a small clearing marked with a single wooden sign. It wasn't an official monument, but people began leaving flowers there anyway. Some left children's toys, others left notes. Most were from strangers, parents who had lost their own children, or simply people who couldn't stop thinking about what it must have been like for that little girl, walking home from church on a sunny April day in 1977. Ranger Rowan continued his patrols through Withlacoochee. Every now and then, he'd pass that same section of trail and stop, Just for a moment, he'd look at the spot and think about how close the world came to never knowing what happened, about how much was almost lost. He once told a colleague that it made him look differently at every piece of litter, every scrap of metal, every forgotten object on the forest floor. Because now he knew that sometimes those things weren't garbage. Sometimes they were the last message someone ever left behind. The case itself changed how local law enforcement handled missing person files. Dozens of old cases across the region were reopened for forensic reanalysis, using new technology that hadn't existed when those children vanished. For the first time, detectives felt like time might not be the enemy, that buried answers could still be recovered, even after generations of silence. In the end, the story of Theresa Fillingim wasn't just about tragedy. It was about endurance, of evidence, of memory, and of a mother's faith that her daughter hadn't simply disappeared. Helen would pass away 2 years later, in 2021. On her nightstand, police found two things: a small frame photo of Theresa and a clipping from the newspaper showing the locket under glass. Today, the forest has grown back. The trail is quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the rustle of branches overhead. Most people who hike it have no idea that beneath their feet once lay the answer to a 41-year mystery. But somewhere in that silence, the story still lingers. In the earth, in the trees, and in that small glint of silver that caught the light one humid afternoon after a storm. A reminder that even after decades of darkness, some truths still find their way back to the surface, and that missing never truly means forgotten.